Today, we will be ranking all 12 of the main dungeons in Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask, conquered by the hero of time. Before jumping in, a few quick points of note. I am basing my judgments on the original releases, and I excluded Ganon's Castle, the Moon, and any mini-dungeons from both games. As for the 12 main dungeons, I'll judge them on their aesthetics, both visual and audio, mechanics, storytelling, and enemies, and how all these things combine to make a complete experience. So open your maps, grab your compasses, subscribe to the channel, and let's begin with number 12. Dodongo's cavern, beyond the giant head and ribbed walls, is largely uninspired, aesthetically. A rocky cave filled with rocky textures. The music is a mix of tense metal scrapes and far-off clangs, like equipment falling down a mine shaft, which, while fitting, is more ambient than memorable. Navigating the dungeon is done in a looping swirl from the right side with mild platforming and bomb flowers, opening up the left side, and a simple bomb puzzle leading to the second floor where Link doubles back to the right side, fights the mini-boss in an easy fight with a good set piece, and acquires the bomb bag. All the while, the dungeon introduces fire enemies like Keese, which can annoyingly destroy your shield, though the dungeon is at least merciful enough to restore it later on, as well as bombable enemies like the Beamos and Armos, and Dodongo, whose life stages pass before our very eyes as we snake through the dungeon. A generous clue, L is real by the way, offers the necessary means to open the Dodongo skull, and a final loop leads to King Dodongo himself. A fight that's quite the spectacle, if unspectacular, something that plagues many of these dungeons. Also, this dungeon inexplicably has a lot of business scrubs, offering wares that I don't find to ever be worth the price. Bottom line, aesthetically rather tame, and being the game's second dungeon, Dodongo's Cavern is in a weird position between not quite a tutorial and not quite challenging, reinforcing many ideas from the previous dungeon, making it an inoffensive stepping stone between the later dungeons and the very deliberate tutorializing of its predecessor. Being the first dungeon, not only does Inside the Deku Tree have to be compelling enough to hook you into the gameplay loop, it also has to teach the player what exactly a dungeon is, and what a way to start. The hollowed, cobwebbed interior alludes to something more sinister, perfectly complemented by the music, which sounds like wind blowing through hollow wood, unobtrusive yet enigmatic. The first half of the dungeon sees Link spiraling up concentric rings around a cylinder, and while Navi interrupts to detail things like opening doors, and Deku Scrubs offer useful hints, it's not long until Link obtains the slingshot. Inside the Deku Tree also does a clever job of introducing you to many of the game's basic mechanics, without a text tutorial. The player must prove effective with the slingshot to leave the room and climb to the next floor, where a switch raises time platforms, and lighting a torch unlocks a door, before turning a logical leap into a literal leap and the dungeon's crowning achievement, a leap of faith through the central webbing into its lower half. Hitting a switch lights a torch, which burns a cobweb, teaching the player that fire burns cobwebs, which then can be used to complete another circuit and burn the remaining cobweb. The last puzzle amounts to memorizing the order of 3 numbers provided earlier in the dungeon, and is not well integrated into this living world, and not the last puzzle of this ilk. Eventually we fight Queen Goma, a boss on par with King Dodongo in terms of difficulty, though in my estimation with a bit more menacing reveal, and with a much more interesting relationship to the level, being the parasitic arachnid draining the life from the Great Deku Tree. All of the enemies serve to familiarize the player with the combat. The Deku Babas, Skulltulas, and Deku Scrubs all remain largely fixed to one spot. Bottom line, while its status as a tutorial makes it relatively short and simple, Inside the Deku Tree does a great job showing many of its mechanics, letting their logical conclusions be intuited by the player, a key mechanic throughout the rest of Ocarina's runtime, and leading to the dungeon's best moment, but it falls short on some poorly integrated puzzles and when it has to explain itself in words. On the contrary, inside Jabu Jabu's belly is certainly the most integrated dungeon so far. While the fleshy organic interior is, in fact, really gross, it is also exactly what the inside of a great beast should be, and a very unique idea for a dungeon aesthetic. I especially love slashing the tissue and seeing blue blood jiggling and hearing a groan from Jabu Jabu himself. There are dangly bits like uvulas, membranous doors, spastic organs, and weird lesions and growths. The dungeon's theme sports a percussive drive, almost like a heartbeat, punctuated by unique sounds reminiscent of a grumbling stomach. The twist is that you actually find Princess Ruto inside Jabu Jabu and are forced to navigate with her to open doors, one of which leads to the boomerang, the weapon useful for destroying these weird parasites, which open new ways forward, and most of the otherwise untouchable electric jellyfish. Though, like inside the Deku Tree, this dungeon also contains an out-of-place puzzle room which has you defeating bubbles within a certain time period. After a bit of spatial reasoning, the spiritual stone is also found within Jabu Jabu. In fitting with the grotesquerie of the dungeon, Link swaps the princess in order to perform a marine colonoscopy, in which getting hit is the quickest way to victory. Navigation is largely a repeating up and down throughout the dungeon's 2 floors, which are laid out like a whale from above, meaning that once Baronade is reached on the dungeon's left side, this bioelectric anemone is electroshocking the great whale's heart, if Jabu Jabu is in fact a whale. Bottom line, as the last of the 3 introductory dungeons, inside Jabu Jabu's belly leaves the player mostly to their own devices, other than a few hints from Navi. Ferrying Ruto throughout Jabu Jabu's insides is also a unique mechanic that doesn't overstay its welcome and ties back to the greater narrative. The overall dungeon aesthetic and attention to detail is great, though I still prefer the Master Quest version with the cow stuck in living tissue. Snowhead Temple reminds me of a more expansive Dodongo's Cavern. It is aesthetically unexciting, with lots of browns, whites, and blues, layered with a theme reminiscent of distant howling winds and shattering icicles, accentuated by uneasy keys. It does, however, make good use of the Goron mask without forgetting about the Deku mask, pushes the player to solve ice obstacles with the environment before eventually getting the fire arrows, using current puzzle solutions to overcome future navigation challenges, and raising and punching down the central pillar, the main obstacle to maneuver around as you crisscross through the central room. The gimmick of collecting stray fairies also allows more rooms to have extra, sometimes hidden, puzzles, and is overall a gameplay element I enjoy in Majora's dungeons. The added element of floors being fine for Goron Link but slippery for regular Link can be annoying, just like the Goron roll not always being easy to handle in tight, fall to your doom scenarios. Some enemies, like the Ice Wolfos, take a long time to kill and always respawn, but most others are simple, namely these freeze guys, little wisps, and the mid-boss. Goat begins as a unique fight but can quickly become tedious, especially as more obstacles are introduced, but it's ultimately satisfying to buzzsaw him to death. Bottom line, Snow Peak begins the portion of this list that includes large, sprawling, interesting, and competent dungeons that are aesthetically unexciting and mechanically uncomplicated. It has a few moments, some gameplay annoyances, and a boss fight that drags a little too long. In a similar vein, but on the opposite end of the thermal spectrum, the Fire Temple resembles a sandy cauldron made from the crater itself, combined with metal fencing, green tiled rooms which always reminded me of ceramics baked in a kiln or infused with greenish ore, and dark, dank dungeons. The dungeon theme resembles bubbling lava and jettisoned platforms, high and low vocalization sporadic like a crackling fire, but is notably less varied and frankly less interesting with the sampled chanting removed. The dungeon itself sports an assortment of mazes and timed puzzles, though one is actually baked into an obstacle. I especially appreciate how present the sense of height is, how it's incorporated into a late dungeon puzzle, and how this long fall has no effect on Link. The Fire Temple is the first adult dungeon where inside we actually meet an eventual sage, a nice continuation of relationships made by young Link, though Darunia looks exactly the same. He does offer a nice touch regarding the jailed Gorons as food for Volvagia. Freeing Gorons then serves a dual purpose of narratively rescuing Darunia's people and mechanically storing small keys to gate progress. Enemies are largely annoying. Fire slugs, fire keys, and these pustuled like-likes found mainly in these inconvenient flying tile rooms. Defeating the weird bomb-like enemies leads to the Megaton Hammer, which is used to satisfyingly bash in Volvagia's metallic skull, though the boss itself is a bit of a pushover. Bottom line, though visually varied, the Fire Temple is still relatively unexciting. It does have small moments of cleverly integrating its story and mechanics, but suffers from Snowhead syndrome, where it doesn't really offer anything more substantial. On top of the fact that I've never been convinced Link could actually make this jump, I also spent a ridiculously long time trying to reach this platform before realizing I need the Scarecrow song or the long shot. Though Majora's first dungeon, Woodfall's mix of primitive, tropical, and overgrown, the swamp itself literally consumes the temple, and the little details like elaborate bug-decorated doors, ornate carvings, the way the moths hover around the flames, the sweet, sweet stench of poison, the integrated greenery, wooden limbs, pooled water, painted rooms, and navigating the dark coalesce into one of the more unique dungeon aesthetics, complemented by the theme that mimics a panoply of nighttime jungle calls, undergirded by a slinky tribal rhythm. The majority of the dungeon centers around mastering the Deku Mask with Deku skipping and platforming. Tattle still interjects with a tip here and there in case this happens to be your first Zelda game, but it's clear this first dungeon was designed with the difficulty and complexity of a moderately seasoned Ocarina of Time player, while adding stray fairies to provide another layer of challenge. We come to understand the dungeon as the source of the swamp's poisoning, and the turtles, Dino foes, designed to one-shot Deku Link with fire, and Gecko add to the creepy crawly feeling of the swamp. The aboriginal Odalwa is one of the easiest boss fights, made all the easier by the fact that he can be hit in a multitude of ways. Bottom line, Woodfall Temple stands as a cut above the previous dungeons, largely for its aesthetic uniqueness, while also balancing puzzles and navigation centered around not just Deku Link, but also the bow and arrow. Though, as still a mildly uncomplicated dungeon, it doesn't quite reach the same heights as some of the more highly ranked dungeons on this list. If this was a list solely judged on atmosphere, the Shadow Temple would clearly be ranked first. Skulls, endless voids, reapers and their scythes, guillotines, razor blades, a ferry through the underworld, and originally a lot of blood. The Shadow Temple is a torture chamber built on stone, metal, and dirty ground, shrouded in a slow drumming theme, with descending highs and lows like banshees shrieking or demons dwelling in the deep, punctuated by a needling, unnerving staccato. A linear dungeon in itself isn't bad, and it's definitely a welcome respite off the heels of the complex Water Temple or Cross-Time Spirit Temple, whichever you completed last. The Shadow Temple puts the almost immediately acquired hover boots to good use, especially in tandem with the Lens of Truth. One of these two options is what most navigation centers around. There's a good use of bombs and even the iron boots in a wind puzzle that's eventually turned on its head to progress. And unfortunately, another clever puzzle is given away by a sign. I am also not a fan of the silver rupee collecting puzzles, which occur on 3 separate occasions. Besides strangely having a lot of chests, it is perhaps one of the only dungeons that uses Din's fire. And I love the insidiousness of this penultimate room. Though it never directly says anything, the connection with the Shadow Temple to the royal family in Sheikah raises a lot of disturbing questions, mirrored in its enemy variety, which pulls from some classic horrors. Redeads, Gibdos, Skulltulas, Stalfos, Wallmasters, and everyone's favorite tumor, Deadhand. Bongo Bongo is simultaneously creepy and silly, but also appallingly easy, and one of the earliest cliche shoot the hands then the big eye Zelda bosses. Bottom line, the Shadow Temple is a straightforward dungeon carried heavily by its atmosphere and deeper storytelling implications. Though its linearity can be a reprieve from previous dungeons, it is relatively uncomplicated with some very video gamey feeling rupee puzzles. The Spirit Temple is immediately heavy on snake imagery and includes carved texts, like any number of ancient temples, mixed with forms molded from the surrounding sands and the rock of the desert colossus itself, all in homage to the great snake-strewn goddess. The music is one of the better in the series, not just atmospheric, but also memorable, grand and proud before settling into the languid snake charm-like horn. It is also the only dungeon that utilizes Ocarina of Time's time travel mechanic, making it instantly novel. While the child section offers more chances to lose your shield, it also introduces the player to the sun mechanics, while acting as a natural extension of the child dungeons in terms of difficulty and using all of young Link's toolkit, but also encountering adult enemies like Stalfos and Iron Knuckles, as well as new enemies like the Anubis, which must be lured into fire by mirroring their movements. Though it too is plagued by more silver rupee collecting, one in particular you must collect rupees to light a torch to light other torches to get a key. Meeting the Boru at the dungeon entrance and learning more about the greater Gerudo relationship to Ganondorf kicks off the entire premise of the child portion of the dungeon. To find the silver gauntlets, and once they're acquired, we view another story beat which resolves in the adult portion of the temple. As an adult, Link can don the silver gauntlets, push the giant block, and enter the right side of the temple, where he encounters another silver rupee puzzle. We encounter more light puzzles, some of which are partial trolls. Defeating another Iron Knuckle gets us the mirror shield, and marginally more elaborate light puzzles are introduced, Though there are some strange puzzles too. Play Zelda's Lullaby directly in front of this door to open this door. Like the child portion, the adult portion employs many of your adult items, making the Anubis much easier to kill. Upon reaching the boss door, we're reunited with the Twin Witches and Naboru, which leads to the final boss fight. Part 1 of the Twin Rover boss fight is well-intentioned in concept, but a little clunky in execution, until Twin Rover's powers combine to form the hottest boss. Jesus. But even this phase is relatively brainless. Bottom line, combined with a stellar ancient atmosphere, the Spirit Temple is singular in its use of Ocarina's time travel mechanics. Though the Iron Knuckle boss fights are highlights of the dungeon, too many Silver Rupee puzzles and a boss fight that is hot in design but cold in execution hold this temple back. Also, fuck these pots! The Forest Temple is one of the most interesting in the Zelda series. It has the unique, dilapidated mix of fortress and Greek temple, pediment included, slowly being reclaimed by the forest in which it's situated. Its combination of stone halls and chambers, green inner courtyards, essential routes to circumvent locked paths and out-of-reach floors, regal twisted halls, and strangely oriented rooms all point to something narratively rich like the Shadow Temple, but also quite inexplicable and vague, reinforcing its mysterious atmosphere. Like it's abandoned, but something mysterious may still roam its halls. I also for some reason have a distinct memory of this checkered floor, which I don't think appears anywhere else, but it's always one of the first images in my head when I think about the Forest Temple. Probably because I'm a fan of the botanical chic aesthetic. Additionally, its music is not only one of the best in the game, but one of the best in gaming. A perfect blend of mysterious and eerie, combining rattling wood, ethereal synths, and frolicking pipes like laughter or an enchanted fawn in a forest glade. Its overall mechanics and navigation revolve around reigniting 4 flames by beating 4 pose sisters, returning function to the central elevator, while also evolving the puzzle complexity. Block puzzles have restricted lines of sight, there's a clever twist on an eye switch, a cheeky chest containing a small key that may long go unnoticed, and coaxing the pose from the portraits is awesome, excellently incorporating the quintessential bow and great foreshadowing, even if their fights are pretty lackluster. However, the timed block Poe puzzle is another one of those puzzles that I feel is out of place and that I don't particularly like. The final Poe fight is also pretty weak. Though some enemies from Link's childhood return, like the immediate greeting of Wolfos, there are also stronger enemies, notably the first introduction of Wallmasters and the duels with a duo of Stelphos. After reaching the weird subterranean art gallery, there's a great fake-out with Phantom Ganon, who is definitely one of the coolest looking bosses, and who builds off of the Poe portrait shooting while also prepping us for a portion of the final fight, even if he's still relatively easy. Bottom line, the Forest Temple is an immaculately crafted atmosphere both visually and sonically, and succeeds in greatly upping the puzzle and navigation challenges from the Young Link dungeons. Though there is an overall reliance on eye switches, less than stellar combat encounters, and an underwhelming puzzle. Also, I love this animation. First of all, when there is only one dungeon you enter by riding on a giant sea turtle, it deserves extra points. The Great Bay Temple is very strange, an industrial water treatment plant built around a series of interconnected pipes, valves, and the gears they turn. Water constantly drips from the ceiling like the whole dungeon is ready to burst at the seams. Navigation and puzzles focus around currents and the power of water, funneling Link through certain corridors thanks to the large central turbine, which hugging the wall makes less frustrating, while the different pipes act as waypoints integrated into the overall dungeon design. The main theme carries through this industrial motif, with a percussion like pipes rattling and metal clangs on a conveyor of overlapping tense, discordant notes, interrupted by an angelic organ and subtle buzzings. There's a nice emphasis on the interplay of the fire and ice arrows, and using the new ice arrows to turn enemies and the broader environment into points of progression and fairy puzzles. At about the midpoint, the gears are reversed and the dungeon is no longer just about understanding how freezing and thawing water can alter the environment in different ways, but in navigating through areas in the opposite direction. Though there are quite a few cutscenes involved in these puzzles, which may become overbearing the more you mess up. I respect the fact that this dungeon lets you pick the path you want, even if it's out of order or you may have to retrace your steps. That's the consequence that comes along with a dungeon that has a bit more freedom of navigation, though some tight spots make it difficult to maneuver with speed as a Zora. The two mini-bosses can be hard-hitting and can break down into absolute chaos if you haven't figured out their gimmick. But Georg, the final boss, sucks. Switching from Land Link with bow to Zora water magic is actually quick and snappy. It's when Georg reacts to you immediately or when you mistime a jump that you get eaten and things become tedious. Bottom line, the Great Bay Temple is a unique dungeon setting that expertly integrates its gameplay mechanics into its design. It offers some small freedoms in path taking that can lead to backtracking. Beyond a few mobility issues, the dungeon is only really mired by some tough or otherwise frustrating bosses. While the Forest and Fire temples are largely named for their settings, the Shadow Temple for its narrative themes, and the Spirit Temple for both its gameplay and narrative themes of twin spirits and double links, the Water Temple is the first to be thematically resonant in its setting, gameplay, and narrative themes. Inspired by an Eastern temple or shrine, pagoda style, the calming, reflective ripples are meant to focus the player into a meditative state, bolstered by the theme's contemplative, twinkling raindrop qualities mixed with acoustic strings. The serpentine layout is echoed in the recurring motif of coiling purple dragons, and the labyrinthine nature becomes enhanced by the dungeon's central mechanic. Changing the water levels is not only an inspired gameplay mechanic, but also forces you to understand the entire dungeon volumetrically. And the dungeon itself forces you to pay extra attention, especially at this raised platform in the central tower, and the block behind the long shot, lest you carry on a key short. The few enemies the dungeon has can mostly be blasted by the hookshot. Further deepening this theme of contemplation, while the Serenade of Water asks Link to reflect upon himself, the battle with Dark Link, the best and hardest mini-boss on this list, asks Link to conquer himself, a metaphor for the player completing this temple. I've spoken at length about the Water Temple and its cohesive design before, about how the first floor corridors are all uniquely marked, how earlier clues point to later revelations, and how most of the offshoot rooms continue to focus on water-related puzzles, hookshotting up a waterfall, overcoming directional currents, platforming across waterspouts. Then there's the rendezvous with Ruto, and damn man, she's like way different. By the end, it's clear that Link is not the only one affected by his destiny, but also those he made certain promises to. Probably the only misstep of the dungeon is the boss. In the boss room, Navi says this isn't normal water, and she's right, it's dog water. Morpha is so bad, and the only real part of the dungeon I find to be an absolute drag. Bottom line, is the long shot merely an upgrade of an older weapon? Yes. Does pausing to change boots suck? Yes. Is Morpha maybe the worst boss in these dungeons? Yes. I get all that. And you know what? I don't care. The joy I have of unraveling this Gordian knot of a dungeon, reflecting on the complete picture of its mechanical, aesthetic, and narrative themes, overcoming the mirage of self-delusion, and by extension this challenge, whew, there's hardly anything like it. There really isn't much to say other than there is simply nothing like the Stone Tower Temple. Its aesthetics, gameplay mechanics, and even narrative are so bizarre and unique that there was simply no way it wouldn't top the list. Entering the dungeon reveals a giant skull at the top of a tower built in arrogance. Rusted steel, intricate carvings and paintings decorate this dungeon defiantly open to the sky. Out-of-place switches and chests hint at what's to come, and the dungeon does a great job taking advantage of the recently acquired mirror shield with more intricate light puzzles, Elegy of Emptiness, and utilizing all of the transformation masks, allowing for an assortment of puzzles that involve spatial reasoning and even the obscure bomb chew. Its theme is instantly memorable, on par with the Forest Temple theme, metallic percussion anchored by deep chants, a bouncing melody eventually overtaken by the high note riff, emphasizing both the high and low ends of the musical spectrum, like the theme flipping as it plays. And of course, the piece de resistance, utilizing all Link's tools once the light arrows are acquired and the dungeon is literally flipped on its head, now firmly affixed to the vault of heaven, open to the endless world below, and further changing its orientation from the inside. Stone Tower Temple introduces more formidable enemies, specifically the Death Armos, Negeron, and Igor, while also having 3 mini-bosses. The Garrow Master, who has either infiltrated or is guarding the dungeon, the repeat Wizrobe, and the 3rd mini-boss, Gomez, the googly-eyed Reaper shrouded in Keese. It is also the only dungeon where Link acquires a mask that is used to fight the final boss, which is challenged by jumping through a strange sand warp into what I can only assume is a different dimension. Twin Mold, though visually spectacular and grand in scale, can be quite the drawn-out fight even with the Giant's Mask. Bottom line, Stone Tower Temple is singular in every respect and incorporates all the transformation masks into a dungeon, cementing it as both the ultimate challenge and the pinnacle of dungeon design. So there you have it, my ranking of all the Hero of Time's dungeons. If you've made it this far, comment your rankings, and if the Water Temple is not in your top 5, feel free to rationalize why you're wrong. As always, thanks for watching.